In today's lesson, we are skipping ahead a little in history and are arriving at one of the probably most well-known Russian czars, Ivan IV, or as he's also known, Ivan the Terrible. And Ivan the Terrible played a major role in creating a centralized Russian state and establishing a stronger political hierarchy. Ivan IV became the Grand Prince of Moscow at the age of 16 and was later crowned the first Tsar of Russia. So he became the Russian ruler at a very young age, and it's important to mention that his childhood was not an easy one. It was surrounded by behind-the-scenes fightings of the elites, their intrigues, and even murder. And this background eventually played a major role in what kind of a ruler and person Ivan became. And I guess it is summarized in his title, Terrible. But actually, pretty early in his reign, Ivan wasn't bad at all. He actually introduced several important reforms that were quite progressive for his time. He worked with advisory councils. He encouraged self-government in some areas. He reorganized church administration, and he promoted some beneficial trade agreements. So, doesn't sound terrible at all, right? Now, before I continue, I want to comment on the name Ivan the Terrible. In English, the word terrible sounds very negative, almost evil, and definitely connected to terror. But the original Russian word, Grozny, Ivan Grozny, has a more complex meaning. It is closer to strict and fearsome. So it's basically a person who projects fear and respect by being strict, but probably still by being just. And at the beginning, Ivan was projecting this fear mostly to the outside of Russia. So, as it was expected for this period of history, greatness of a ruler depended on the size of his territory. And militarily, Ivan was very successful. Under Ivan the Terrible, Russia began transforming into this large multinational state that we know today. In the mid-16th century, his conquests pushed Russian borders deep into the Volga region and towards Siberia. And this expansion helped create kind of like buffer zones around Moscow, making the core of the state easier to defend, and that was his main goal. Ivan's armies conquered multiple neighboring territories, including the khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, and that really expanded the Russian territory. Now, there's a legend connected to probably the most famous landmark of Moscow, the St. Basil's Cathedral, that you probably see whenever Moscow is mentioned in the media, and you can also see it right here on the slide. So, St. Basil's Cathedral was built in Moscow to celebrate the conquest of Kazan. And according to this legend, Ivan later ordered all architects to be blinded so they would never create anything more beautiful ever again, or as beautiful. Now, whether this story is true or not, it shows us the terrifying image associated with Ivan in Russian history. There's actually another theory that Ivan himself deliberately promoted this image as a kind of a political self-marketing, if we put it in modern terms. Because one of his main goals was to create the image of this unquestionable absolute ruler who is kind of above the law. And this connects actually to the larger theme or trend that I keep bringing up in this overview and in my videos, and that's the quest for centralized authority. So Ivan wanted complete control over the state. He believed that strong centralized power was necessary for expansion and for military successes and for political stability. And actually, this need to have the political stability under one central authority might not sound like a totally bad idea, right? But the problem was with Ivan himself, because over time, his reign actually became associated with increased repression and violence and terror and even madness. And here I'm kind of like summarize his path to madness very quickly, but basically after a serious illness, and especially after the death of his beloved wife, who was most likely poisoned by the elites, Ivan became increasingly paranoid. He began suspecting nobles and advisors and even members of his own family of plotting against him. And eventually he created the Oprichniki, a terror force, kind of like a little army personally loyal to him. And the concept of Oprichniki and Oprichnina is a very interesting one. I'm not going to go into more detail here in this overview. But what's important for us to understand is that those who were loyal to him to the point of being ready to commit heinous crimes, were receiving land and benefits, basically becoming a new elite based primarily on their limitless loyalty to Ivan. In the Oprichniki carried out brutal punishments, executions, land confiscations, mass repressions all across the country. And one of the most infamous episodes connected to Oprichniki was the massacre of Novgorod. And you remember I did mention Novgorod at the beginning of this lecture series, and it's very interesting that even after Tatar-Mongol yoke ended, Novgorod still kept a somewhat different political culture compared to much of the rest of Russia. It actually preserved all traditions of local assemblies, collective decision-making, and basically at this time, Novgorod still had a relative political autonomy. So in many ways, Novgorod represented an alternative political model, one less centered around absolute authority and kind of like more democratic, again, if we put it in more modern terms. And that was dangerous from Ivan's perspective because authoritarian systems anywhere do not tolerate alternative political setups. So Ivan suspected Novgorod of disloyalty and treason, and the result was brutal repression carried out by the Oprichniki. Many of the city elites were executed, their property was confiscated, but most importantly, Novgorod's independent political traditions were effectively destroyed. Okay, now what about the ordinary people? Did their lives improve? And at this point, my students unanimously say, no, not really, and they're absolutely right. Because to maintain wars and expansion and centralized authority, the state needed enormous resources, money, manpower, so taxes increased. Freedom to move for peasants became even more restricted. Now, earlier we discussed how peasants still technically had one limited period each year when they could leave their landowner, and under Ivan IV, it is still valid, but increased taxes and more obligations made it nearly impossible in practice. And this was another step in this gradual process that eventually led towards creating full serfdom in Russia. So the reign of Ivan the Terrible became another major step towards centralized autocratic rule in Russia. And as the time went by, Ivan's personal paranoia continued getting worse. Eventually, even his own son became a victim. According to historical accounts, during a violent argument, Ivan the Terrible struck his son Ivan on the head with his staff, and the injury was fatal. And you can actually see this scene in one of the most famous paintings in Russian art. And this painting is created by another Ivan, or Ivan Riepin, and it's titled Ivan the Terrible and His Son Ivan. And over time, this painting itself became a powerful symbol of the tragic consequences of absolute power. Now, the death of his son created a dynastic crisis in Russia. Ivan the son wasn't Ivan the Terrible's only child, and he actually wasn't his only son. Also, there was another son named Dmitri who died young and under suspicious circumstances, and I mentioned here so you can keep it in mind for the next lecture. And Ivan the Terrible still had other kids and another son who could continue the dynasty. He had girls, but at this point, girls could not inherit the throne. And his other son's name was Fyodor. But Ivan the Terrible did not really consider Fyodor capable of ruling effectively, and he was right, because for the most part, all decisions during Fyodor's rule were made by his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. But Fyodor did become the Tsar, and when later he died without a strong heir, actually without leaving an heir, the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia for centuries, effectively came to an end. And that opened doors to one of the most chaotic and unstable periods in Russian history, the time of troubles, and that's going to be the topic of our next lesson. Thank you.
If you like it, please click like. If it's useful,